Let's just go to Cal though. What went wrong? What ultimately went wrong, other than the wins and losses, which is a really easy way to probably answer this question.
I think it's a number of things. You could go with the stylistic. I always tell people that I feel like 2015 was sort of a pivot point for a lot of things that kind of overlapped at once. Cal was ahead of the game with the dribble drive stuff. Vance Wahlberg comes in, who's coaching at Fresno State now, and Cal is ahead of the game, and he overhauls his system, and he puts this system in that's like guys attacking off the catch, fewer ball screens, beat your man one-on-one, get to the rack, get fouled, throw it up on the glass, get a dunk. Very fun when you have, and that style works to recruit the best of the best when you have these like incendiary downhill point guards. And he had those guys for a while from that stretch from 2000, honestly, the early 2000s, all the way up through, that run. And, as basketball started to change, this is just one of the reasons I think he started to have an issue is, he liked to play that way. He also liked to pound it inside, beat you in transition, be more athletic than you. I heard somebody say one time, they were like, if Cal could recruit the NFL Combine, he would. He prefers speed and size over everything. And then I think as the game started to kind of change, I think that 15 game that he lost against that like 5-out Wisconsin team that, you could switch everything and it was fine. They had a guy that could, at all 5 positions, they could shoot, dribble, pass. He lost that game. I've heard people say that, like, personally, that took a big toll on him, that was, the epitome of his style, length, size, athleticism, and they lose, almost have an undefeated season. And then he does evolve slowly over time. He finally, it led to this past season where he started to just kind of really embrace the 5-out stuff, like aggressively hunting threes and things like that. But when you start to look at the other part of it, I think early on in his tenure, he adopted the one and done thing first. He acts like it was some big like idea that he had that Coach K stole from him. It's not like it was some like crazy schematic innovation that only one person could think of. He was just like, hey, let's take the kids that are only going to be here for a year and do it was a different way to coach, and he got really good at it. But as I think like the landscape of like agencies and things like that shifted with the LeBron and Clutch stuff going away from the World Wide West part of the world, I think that affected his pipeline of talent. And then I think, he just sort of got into this mode after 2015 from, in 2019, where he was trying to recapture the glory kind of thing. So you start hiring old staff members and things like that, and you think it's going to be the exact same way it was. And it just wasn't. And I think at the end of it, I think his desperation kind of made teams tight. There are a lot of questions about their preparation down the stretch, like staff members pulling their weight, things like that. There's a lot of that out there that you can go find if you're interested. But I think that he just kind of stayed a little too long. So, I think it worked out the best way that it could because, if they'd had to fire him, I think that the sting would have been a little harder to bear. But since he went on his own, I think ultimately his legacy will be okay. But he just stayed a little too long, I think ultimately is what it came down to.
First 3 years, and we see this with a lot of guys when they get the job, right? Like the destination dream job. First 3 years, Elite Eight, Final Four champs. The next 12 years, one Final Four. His last week 16 was 6 years ago. I think the player development part of it, he's a little underrated towards the end. Like we know the headliner names, but whether it was Maxey or Quickly, and I know you were locked into every one of those, but I remember before the draft, and look, based on where they got drafted, I think there was like, okay, who are these guys? Like, what exactly are they? And I think Case and Wallace, who obviously got drafted higher, so Presti, his track record, you're like, okay, so they see something there. Like, all of these guys are really good. Like, if Wallace was on a different team, he'd be putting up like real numbers right away. Mm-hmm. And so the player development part, like I remember when Cal got all that shit of like, hey, I had 5 first rounders and the lottery picks, like that's better than a national title. He came on with Van Pelt and I very soon after and like was kind of selling that. And I always liked him. Like when we had him in studio, it's hard not to really like him. But what did Kentucky fans think of him getting the Arkansas offer after Kentucky's debating whether or not to even keep him around based on the buyout? And then asking if Kentucky wants to counter it. Like, is that just the way all of them are wired, the way Cal's wired? Because that'd be like even if I like Cal, but I was a Kentucky guy, I'd be like, hey, fuck off.
Yeah, I don't know if it was quite that strong, but the administration maybe felt that way. I think people just kind of like had this feeling of really, like really, and I think the reason we felt that way is he just he got to the point where, you know, I've always said this, that like climbing Cal was like a whole different animal. I always reference this. There's this, you can go back and watch this. There's this Martin Luther King town hall meeting that Cal was like the only white guy that was a part of it. And he's up there and he's got his big watch on and his nice glasses and he's slick and he's got a nice suit on and he's selling this dream of delivering generational wealth and like just, you know, working with families. And you can see his appeal and things like that. You can see why he was such a radical figure, like so appealing as a recruiter and things like that. And when he was climbing, his energy was he's willing to talk to anybody. He'll go out. He's available all the time. Cal at the top, once he had stopped climbing, you talk about getting the dream job. He gets to the top of the mountain. I think he kind of put up walls and almost became like a militaristic like dictator, where he was like, you know, he became paranoid. I think he became really obsessed with criticism. He became obsessed with like petty criticisms of him. And stopped talking to people. So I think what happened was there was a disconnect between him and the temperature of the fan base. So you're talking about like him being surprised, him even throwing that counter offer, I thought was like tone deaf. It was just like, no, man, we're waiting for a reason for you to be out of here. Like basically they came out and held hands on TV, him and the AD, because they had no choice. There were $33 million left on his deal. The school wasn't going to pay that. They knew that he kind of wanted to, you know, obviously he wanted to get that money. Arkansas came in and frankly saved the day for them offering him that job was a nice way out. He violated his contract by not telling the AD that he was talking to them. So that was a nice, like, you know, wipe the sweat. Wow, we dodged a bullet there. So for him to come with a counteroffer was just like, it was laughable. I laughed. I was just like, I mean, it's weird that he's gone, but it worked out the best way that it could.
So Izzo made some comments recently being like this job, right? And I had Lefko on Tuesday and he was talking about how like Jay Wright had to have this out of body experience to understand how miserable he was, even though he was incredibly successful. Miserable is probably not the right word. Like he emphasized just how tired he was and how when Jay stays and talks to coaches when they were on the road and Jay would just leave the meeting and be like, that coach is like losing it. And, you know, Saban speaking out about where college athletics are headed. There's no, especially it's, I would say in the media and depending on your age, there's like no one going, hey, good point. Because they're like, fuck you guys. You've made millions and millions of dollars. This entire system has been rigged. And finally, the players are getting compensated, even though it's still limited in comparison to the NCAA, keeping all the money. The transfer portal part of it's opened up. I like to look at things a little differently and say, hey, if you worked in an industry 20, 30 years and all of a sudden it's completely different, you wouldn't be thinking about the money you'd be making. You'd be thinking about like, okay, what is my job right now? And the NIL stuff is probably comically overrated in comparison to like what's really happening with some of it, but at least it's happening. So I'm in favor of it. I don't feel like that's the Cal part of it at all, because he just took another job and Arkansas is going to be full of all sorts of energy. People that didn't want to get involved financially before are now going to get involved. So it's a complete win for Cal. It's a win for Arkansas and it's all those things, but like, it's a sport that you love. And I feel better about what's happening for the players, but long-term, I don't think these staples of the industry are like completely wrong about their fear of the future.
Yeah, I think what we're going to see is I think we're just going to it's sort of going to accelerate. It's sort of similar to what's happened in the NBA with like the pace and space thing. If you watch the guys who are over 30, the numbers have really changed a lot because the game changed so radically. I think it's similar to what we're going to see, a new era of coach who's just more equipped and ready to do this. It's not going to be as much of a system shock for them to come in. And I think we're going to continue to see a lot of that change even more. Like, I've talked about, I thought if Kentucky in particular was serious about evolving and changing, they should hire a GM. I think that pipeline is going to open up. I think one of the things that coaches are complaining about is that it's a lot for one person to handle. And I don't think that that's wrong. And not that they aren't handling a lot as it is, but, year by year, recruiting your guys to stay, figuring out ways to compensate them that are like very, on the ledger and above board and everything. You got to I know that Kentucky in particular had a lot of problem with that this year. I know you bring in somebody that handles that handles identifying talent, that makes sure that their deals are in place so that they work with the coach and then the coach can coach. I don't think that you can introduce significant compensation into the equation without really radically changing the way the org chart works for some of these. But I think that like we're going to see fewer and fewer of the like long time established icons like Izzo and Cal. I just don't think it's going to happen as much because it's going to move quicker, in my opinion.